Welcome to the second installment of our enthralling series, where power meets vulnerability and the lines between captor and captive blur. In the opulent yet oppressive halls of Tgun's mansion, emotions ignite and secrets unravel. As Tgun faces the ghosts of his past and the stirrings of a heart he thought long dead, Tina stands at the center of a storm that could either break him or set him free. Joined by Idris, whose loyalty is tested by the truths he uncovers, prepare to dive deeper into a world where every revelation brings them closer to salvation or destruction. Let the journey continue.
Tgun stormed down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest, fists clenched. The sight of Idris and Tina in the room together had triggered something. Anger, jealousy, sadness, all swirling inside him. But he didn't know why. He told himself it didn't matter. It shouldn't matter. But deep down, the sharp ache in his chest said otherwise. As Tgun retreated to his private quarters, trying to shake off the confusion, Idris followed, determined to clear the air. "Tgun," Idris said sharply, catching up to him in the dimly lit corridor. "Wait, we need to talk." Tgun didn't stop. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to feel. But Idris wasn't one to back down. He knew what was happening, even if Tgun didn't want to admit it. "I don't need to know what Idris chooses to do with his prisoner," Tgun growled, his voice cold and distant. "Whatever you do with her, it's your business." Idris, frustrated and visibly angry, stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Stop pretending, Tgun. Stop acting like you don't care. You've kept her here all this time. Why? Why did you ask if she had eaten? Why do you care what happens to her?" Tgun stiffened, his jaw clenched tightly. He couldn't answer. He didn't want to know the answer. Idris continued, his voice rising. "You like her. Just admit it. You've kept her locked up here, but you can't stand the thought of letting her go." "I don't know what you're talking about," Tgun snapped, his eyes darkening with anger. "I don't need anyone, least of all some woman." "You're lying," Idris shot back. "You're lying to yourself, Tgun, and it's going to tear you apart. You don't even know why you're angry right now. You're jealous." Tgun's fists tightened as the heat of his emotions boiled over. He charged toward Idris, his voice like ice. "I need no woman, and I need no lecture from you." For a moment, they stood toe-to-toe, tension thick in the air. Then, in a voice laced with frustration and resignation, Idris said, "Fine. You want the truth? Tina wants to leave." The words hit Tgun like a physical blow, though he masked it well. A sharp pain cut through him, but he quickly shook it off. "Then let her go," he said, his tone hollow. "Release her." "I don't care." Idris stared at him, searching for the truth behind his cold facade. "Are you sure, Tgun? Are you really sure you want her to leave?" Tgun's silence spoke volumes. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Idris, shaking his head, left the room without another word, leaving Tgun standing alone, the weight of his words hanging in the air. That night, the mansion was quiet, but Tgun's mind was anything but. He couldn't sleep. His thoughts spun, restless and relentless. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Tina, her defiance, her strength, the fire in her eyes when she had challenged him. And now, the thought of her leaving twisted his insides in ways he couldn't explain. Why did he care? Why was this bothering him? He had spent years building walls around his heart, around his life. No one could hurt him if he felt nothing, if he needed nothing. But Tina, she was slipping through those cracks and it terrified him. The hours stretched long into the night, and Tgun found himself pacing, his emotions a storm he couldn't control. The next morning, by dawn, Tgun had made up his mind. He would end this before it got any worse. He couldn't afford to feel anything for her, to let her into the parts of himself he had buried so deep. He had learned long ago that love was weakness, and weakness was fatal. His father's downfall had proven that. He wouldn't make the same mistake. He found Tina alone, standing by the window, looking out over the estate she had been a prisoner in for so long. Without preamble, he spoke, his voice cold and detached. "You're free to go." Tina turned, surprise flickering in her eyes. "You're letting me go?" Tgun's heart twisted painfully, but he kept his face unreadable. "Yes, leave. I don't care where you go. Just go." Anger and sadness roiled within him, though he wouldn't allow himself to show it. As she stood there, staring at him in disbelief, Idris stepped forward, attempting to reason with him, his voice barely above a whisper. "She has nowhere to go," Idris whispered urgently. "You burned down her home. She can go wherever she pleases." Tgun cut him off bluntly, his voice hard and emotionless. "But not under my roof anymore." Tina, feeling the weight of his words and the reality of her situation, was escorted by the guards toward the gate. She walked without looking back, her heart heavy, and a wave of uncertainty about her next steps flooding her mind. As they neared the gate, Idris, determined to help, swiftly handed her a small folded note. Tina glanced at it quickly, noticing the name Villa Guest House scribbled on it. It was Idris' family business, a place where she could stay safely, away from Tgun's world, at least for a while. She clutched the note tightly, grateful but still too hurt to acknowledge the kindness fully. Tgun wasn't the same after Tina left. He pretended nothing had changed, continued to run his empire with the same ruthless efficiency. But inside, something was missing. Something he couldn't name, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Late at night, he found himself wandering into the room she had stayed in. It was empty now, cold and lifeless. He would sit there for hours, staring at the bed where she had slept, the dresser where she had kept her things. One night, as he sat alone in the room, he spotted the dress she had worn to the party, the one she had worn when he had first seen her as more than just a prisoner. It was hanging in the corner, a silent reminder of everything he had lost without even realizing it. Tgun sank into the chair by the window, his head in his hands, the weight of his emotions finally breaking through the walls he had spent years building. He sat there for what felt like hours, lost in his thoughts, lost in the realization of what he had done. For the first time in years, Tgun felt something other than anger or hatred. He felt loss. He had pushed her away, and now he was alone. He finally understood that he loved her, but it was too late. She was gone, and deep down he believed she could never love him back. He was too broken, too damaged. He couldn't be loved. He didn't deserve it. He didn't want to go through what his father had gone through. Love had destroyed his father, and now it was tearing him apart too. But unlike his father, Tgun wouldn't let love destroy him. He would bury it just like he buried everything else. He would lock it away where it couldn't hurt him anymore, even if it meant living the rest of his life in the cold, empty mansion, alone. Because he had learned one thing for certain. Love was a weakness he couldn't afford. For the next few days, Tgun worked relentlessly, pushing himself harder than ever before. He was determined to drown out the gnawing ache inside him. But no matter how many deals he closed, how many enemies he crushed, it wasn't enough. His men noticed the change. Tgun wasn't the same. His sharpness dulled, his once ironclad control frayed. He became a shadow of himself, going through the motions of running his empire but with a hollowness that no one could ignore. And Idris saw it most of all. Idris knew his boss and friend better than anyone, and he understood the internal conflict Tgun was going through. He watched as Tgun pretended to be unaffected, even as he sank deeper into himself, haunted by the memory of Tina's departure. Idris saw the way Tgun avoided her empty room, how his hands trembled when he spoke about mundane tasks. Something was eating him alive, and Idris knew exactly what it was. Tgun's feelings for Tina. Feelings that Tgun would rather destroy himself than admit. It became clear to Idris that if he didn't step in, Tgun would only spiral further. Determined to save him from his own pain, Idris made a decision. He would go to Tina and tell her everything. The truth about Thomas. The truth about Tgun. Idris visited Tina at the villa a few days after she had settled in. As they sat together in the quiet of the guest house's garden, Idris asked softly, "How are you settling in? Is everything comfortable?" Tina nodded, offering him a small smile. "Yes, it's fine. Thank you for helping me. I don't know where I would have gone without this place." Idris smiled but remained quiet for a moment, sensing the storm of emotions within her. Tina took a deep breath, her voice uncertain as she continued. "I've been thinking I should leave the city. There's nothing for me here anymore. My uncle's gone, and I have no reason to stay." Idris hesitated, then looked at her seriously. "Tina, your uncle isn't dead." The words hit her like a punch. Tina's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, that's not possible. I was there. Tgun set the house on fire." Idris sighed deeply, preparing for the difficult truth. "Your uncle stole from Tgun. When he found out Tgun knew, he fled that same night. That's why Tgun burned the house. He wanted to punish him. And you, for challenging him." Tina shook her head, her mind racing. "But why did he make me believe my uncle was dead?" Idris leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Tina, you assumed your uncle was in the house when it burned. But Tgun just let you believe that. He never confirmed it, but he didn't correct you either. He kept you as his prisoner, using your guilt and fear to punish you for standing up to him." Tina's face hardened as the truth sank in. "So, he let me believe a lie, just to break me," she murmured, her voice shaking. Tina sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything. The weight of the truth crashed over her, filling her with a mixture of anger, relief, and confusion. Tina's tears flowed freely as she sat, her voice shaking with pain. Idris sighed, stepping closer, his tone softer now. "Tina, I'm sorry. I should have told you about your uncle sooner. I didn't mean to keep this from you, but..." His voice trailed off as he tried to explain, feeling the weight of her pain. Tina wiped her eyes. "It's not your fault, Idris. It's that monster, Gun. He's the one to blame for everything." Idris shook his head gently. "He's not a monster, Tina. I know it looks that way now, but the truth is, he wasn't always like this. Life made him that way." Idris knew this was the moment to reveal Tgun's past. He couldn't sugarcoat what had been done, but he needed her to see the layers beneath the cold, brutal exterior. So, Idris began to tell the story, hoping that it would open her eyes to the man Tgun truly was. Tina, still shaken, glanced at him, uncertain. But something in Idris's tone urged her to listen, even if her heart was reluctant to hear more about the man who had hurt her. Idris sighed. He wasn't always Tgun. He wasn't always this hardened. You see, Thomas had a different life once, a simpler one. He paused, recalling the scene in vivid detail. It was just after 2 a.m. Rain was pouring down and Thomas, a boy then, was sound asleep. His dreams were uneasy, and when he finally woke up, he heard voices outside. Words he'd never forget. Hit him harder. Curiosity pulled him to the window, and that's when he saw it. A group of men beating his father in the middle of a storm. His mother, she was there too, but she wasn't helping. No, her lips were curled into a cruel smile, and her arm was linked with Chief Bam, her new lover. She didn't care that her husband was on the ground, bleeding. She didn't care about Thomas. Idris saw Tina's eyes widen, her expression softening as she listened. Thomas ran out trying to save his father, but his mother, she climbed into Bam's car and left them there, in the rain. She just smiled as she drove away. Idris clenched his fists, recalling how Tgun had told him that part of his story. Idris continues, watching Tina's expression carefully. But it didn't end there. Weeks later, after his father had just barely recovered, his mother came back. Not to reconcile. No, she came to collect her things. I still remember the way Thomas said he had stood there, watching her, hoping for something. Anything to make sense of it all. And do you know what she told him? Idris' voice lowers, filled with quiet intensity. I never loved you. I never loved your father. And Thomas, don't be like your father. He's a failure. You'll be one too. You probably know Thomas, or Tgun, as he's known now. But back then, he was just a kid, like any of us trying to get by. I met him after his family's life fell apart. But the story didn't begin there. Thomas's father tried to pick up the pieces after his wife's betrayal. He searched for jobs, any honest work that would let him take care of his son. But in a town controlled by Chief Bam, the man who stole his wife, it didn't matter how hard Thomas's father worked. Doors were slammed in his face at every turn. Chief Bam's influence was everywhere, and he made sure no one would employ him. Thomas watched his father sink deeper into despair. Once a proud man, now reduced to pleading for basic work. The shame weighed on both of them, and the whispers of gossip never stopped. It became too much to bear. One night, with the last of his dignity, Thomas's father gathered their things, and they left the town they once called home. The town they moved to was small, quiet, far from Chief Bam's reach. But it was also a place where no one knew them, and starting over felt like dragging a boulder up a mountain. Thomas's father found work as a security guard at a rundown mall, and it paid just enough to keep a roof over their heads. But it wasn't much. This is where I first saw Thomas. He'd rush to the market after school, offering to clean shoes, to help his father however he could. He didn't complain, he worked, but the weight of what they had lost never left his eyes. The day I met Thomas, it was pouring rain, like the sky was warning us of something. The market was busy as usual, but that quiet crept in, the one that makes your skin crawl. People started whispering, closing their shops, moving fast like they knew trouble was coming. I didn't think twice. I ran to warn him. Run, Thomas. Hide, I shouted as I grabbed his arm. His face was confused, but he didn't move. I don't know why, but I stayed too, standing with him in the middle of the market as those men in black appeared like ghosts out of the rain. I had heard about them, everyone had. They were Don's men, and whenever they showed up, it never ended well. One of the men spotted us, and before I could even think, he grabbed Thomas and pulled him toward a sleek black car that had just arrived. I wanted to fight, to help him, but my legs felt like stone. All I could do was watch as they dragged him away. His cries, his fear. It all reminded me of the stories we'd heard. Once Don had you, you didn't come back the same. Thomas was thrown into the car. But the worst part? As he looked back through the rain, I could see it in his eyes. He didn't know if he would live to see another day. The car disappeared into the storm, but I couldn't leave it at that. I had to find a way to get to him. But before I could do anything, more chaos broke loose. The market leader was dragged into the street, begging for mercy. Don stepped out of the car, tall and menacing. His voice calm like this was just another routine. You come to me when you need help, but now you forget our deal? Don's voice cut through the air, sending chills down my spine. "Teach him a lesson," he ordered. I watched as the men beat the market leader to the ground. His cries mixed with the rain, and I thought of Thomas. What he was facing, how terrified he must be, him, in the back of that sleek car, terrified. He wasn't just any boy. He was quiet, always working hard to help his father. I knew what was coming for him, the whispers about Don. How once you were in his grasp, you didn't come back the same, hung in the air like a curse. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding in my chest as Don's men beat him mercilessly. His cries were swallowed by the rain, but to me, they were deafening. It was a warning, a brutal reminder of what power meant in this world. I wanted to help, to stop it, but fear rooted me to the spot. My own body betrayed me, too scared to act. Instead, I watched, helpless. I knew I had to do something for Thomas. But how? I was just a boy myself. Another face in the crowded streets, unnoticed by the powerful. I had to find a way to get to him, but my options were limited. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out how to approach Don's world and rescue Thomas without getting crushed. The next morning, I was back at the market, trying to push away the thoughts of what happened to Thomas. I couldn't shake the image of him being dragged into that sleek, black car. But to my surprise, there he was. "You're alive?" I asked, almost breathless with relief and confusion. Thomas looked up, a faint smile on his lips, but something about his eyes had changed. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Fine?" I echoed, my voice rising. "What happened last night? They dragged you off." I thought I couldn't finish the sentence. My stomach had been twisted with worry the whole night. Thomas leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing a dangerous secret. "I need to tell you something," he said. "What happened yesterday wasn't what you think. It was different." I could see he was holding back, wrestling with his thoughts. "Tell me, Thomas," I urged. "What did Don do?" Taking a deep breath, he began to explain. "After Don took me into that car, I thought my life was over. I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen next. But when we reached his mansion, it was different. He didn't hurt me. Instead, he offered me a chance. I was confused. A chance? What kind of chance?" "A job," he replied, his eyes dark with a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't quite place. "He said he saw something in me. He said I wasn't like other kids, that I had potential." I listened as Thomas narrated his encounter with Don, the grandeur of the mansion, the luxury that seemed almost suffocating, the intimidating presence of Don himself. But the strangest thing of all was how Don had spoken to him, as if he were grooming him for something bigger. He made me an offer. He said I could have more than what I have now. He wants me to work for him, to feed his dog, Nero. He promised to pay more than I could think of just to take good care of his dog. I was shocked. "And your father? Does he know?" Thomas shook his head. "I told him about it this morning. He was furious. He doesn't want me anywhere near Don. He told me that people like him destroy lives, like they almost destroyed ours." I could feel my heart sinking. Thomas was standing at a crossroads, and I knew that whatever choice he made would change everything. "Are you going back?" I asked cautiously. He hesitated before answering. "I think I have to. I don't have a choice. We're struggling, and it might be the only way to survive." I wanted to tell him to stay away, that the path Don was offering him was dark and dangerous. But I also knew that Thomas was feeling trapped. By life, by circumstances, by the choices he didn't have. "You don't have to do this," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew Thomas had already made up his mind. As I stood there, I realized how deeply this was all weighing on him. Thomas was still that boy who had seen too much in such a short time, but there was a part of him being drawn into Don's world. I could only hope that whatever happened next wouldn't take away the last piece of innocence he had left. Thomas continued, "My father wants me to stay away, but I don't think he understands how far Don's reach really goes. We're already in his world, whether we want to be or not." And just like that, I knew that Thomas wasn't just considering Don's offer, he was already in. He just needed to figure out how deep he would go. After spending several weeks caring for Nero and gaining Don's quiet approval, Thomas had begun to feel a sense of belonging in Don's world, even though he hadn't fully committed to it. Each visit to the mansion felt like a step deeper into a shadowy life that he both feared and admired. One day, after he finished feeding Nero, Don casually brought up an offer, something more than the small tasks he'd been doing. "You've done well with the dog and the errands," Don said, watching Thomas carefully. "But there's more you could be doing. I could use someone like you among my men." Thomas felt a sudden tension in the air. He knew this offer was a gateway to something darker. He had seen Don's men, how they operated, how they followed orders without question. And though the temptation of money and power tugged at him, something deep inside still hesitated. "I'm not sure if I'm ready for that," Thomas replied honestly, his voice barely above a whisper. Don studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's fair. You've got time to decide. But remember, life doesn't wait forever." Thomas left the mansion that evening, his mind heavy with the decision he wasn't yet ready to make. His father had always warned him about men like Don, about the dangers of falling into their world. But in this new city, where they had nothing, what other choice did he really have? Idris' voice took on a somber tone as he continued. Thomas was at the market, like he did every afternoon, delivering lunch to his father's workplace at the mall when the sound of gunfire ripped through the air. Chaos erupted, people screaming and running in every direction. Thomas ran to the mall, heart pounding, and that was when he saw it. His father, lying on the ground, blood pooling around him. The security job at the mall had been a small solace for his father, a way to keep them afloat after they'd moved here. But now, even that was gone. Thomas dropped to his knees beside his father, begging him to hold on, to fight. But it was too late. His father was gone. I saw it happen, too, from a distance. I wanted to run to him, to help, but everything was happening so fast. When the police arrived, I watched as they pulled Thomas away from his father's lifeless body, and something inside him broke that day. The boy who had once just wanted to help his father was gone. All that was left was anger and pain. Thomas had nothing left. His father's death destroyed the last bit of hope he had. I remember seeing him a few days later, standing outside Don's mansion, drenched in the rain, like a lost soul. When Don opened the gates, it was like he knew. He didn't say anything to Thomas. He just let him in. From then on, Don became his new father, teaching him everything he needed to know about control, power, and fear. But this wasn't just any kind of education. Don groomed him, molded him into a weapon. Every lesson was a test. Every task, a chance for Thomas to prove his loyalty. And Thomas did. In the beginning, Don didn't ask him to do anything violent. Instead, he let Thomas watch. He'd sit quietly at the back of Don's meetings, observing how Don spoke, how he commanded attention, and how everyone obeyed without question. It was like Don was showing him how to rule, slowly shaping him into a leader. But it wasn't long before Don started giving Thomas real responsibilities. It began with small tasks, overseeing collections, making sure the men under Don's control followed through with their orders. Thomas handled it well, never flinching, always calm and precise. And Don noticed. That's when he gave Thomas his first real test. "There's a man who owes me money," Don had said one night, his voice smooth as ever. "He's been avoiding me for too long. I need you to go with the men and make sure he understands the price of betrayal. I remember Thomas telling me about it the next day. He hadn't slept much, he was too wired, too anxious. But there was also a fire in his eyes, like he was finally ready to step into the role Dawn had been preparing him for. That night, they went to the man's house. Thomas didn't tell me all the details, but I could see the change in him after that. Whatever happened that night hardened him. He had crossed a line, one he could never return from. But as cold and ruthless as he became, there was always something deeper inside him, something that held onto the pain of losing his father and the betrayal of his mother. I think that's why he became the man he is today. He buried that pain so deep that it twisted him. Dawn gave him the tools, but the darkness had always been there. Idris paused for a moment, his eyes reflecting the weight of his words. Tgun, the man you know, wasn't born overnight. It was a slow process, one that started with grief, pain, and loss. Dawn may have shaped him, but the fire that burns inside him, that came from everything life took from him. Idris shifted in his seat, remembering how their bond was forged. After Dawn's death, Thomas became even more hardened. He threw himself deeper into the business, cutting off any remaining emotion. Dawn's death had shaken him, but instead of making him weaker, it made him stronger, more dangerous. It was during this time that Thomas truly became Tgun's, the ruthless, as many will say. But I wasn't just some loyal follower for no reason. He paused before continuing. Thomas saved my life, Tina. Before Dawn's death, when my father was drowning in debt, Dawn's men came for him. They were going to punish him, maybe worse. But Tgun stepped in. With just a word, he made them stop and saved my father from the hands of death. That day, I saw it. Thomas was still alive, buried beneath the Tgun cold exterior. After Dawn died, he asked me to work for him, someone he could trust. I stayed because I knew my friend was still there, fighting to survive beneath the monster he's become. I have seen him save others, even if he wouldn't admit it. Idris rubbed his hands together as if warming them, his voice softening. That's why I stayed by his side, even as he became the man he is today. There's still something good in him, Tina. He just doesn't want anyone to see it because he's afraid to be hurt again. Tina sat in stunned silence, her mind racing with everything Idris had just revealed. The anger that had once burned in her chest was now tempered by a quiet sadness. She had assumed Tgun's cruelty came from a place of pure malice, but now she saw a deeper truth. He was a man shaped by pain, burdened by a past that had left him scarred. She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. But what does that change, Idris? He's still done horrible things. To me, to others. How can you expect me to see him as anything other than a monster? Idris leaned forward, his gaze steady. I'm not asking you to forget what he's done. I'm asking you to see beyond it. He's hurt, yes, and he's taken it out on the world in ways I can't defend. But you, Tina, you're different. You've gotten under his skin in a way no one else ever has. That's why he kept you here for so long. He may have pushed you away, but I've seen the way he looks at you. Tina let out a bitter laugh, wiping the tears from her cheeks. And what am I supposed to do with that? He doesn't want me. He made that clear when he threw me out. Idris sighed. He's fighting it. Fighting what he feels because he believes he can't be loved. That no one would ever accept the man he's become. He's convinced himself that if he lets anyone in, he'll just be betrayed again. But I see it in him, Tina. You've stirred something in him, something good, something human. Tina closed her eyes, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She had come to despise Tgun for what he had done. But now, knowing the story behind his cruelty, she wasn't sure how to feel anymore. After a long pause, she whispered, Why are you telling me this, Idris? Why do you care? Idris stood and walked toward the window, his back to her. Because I've seen what love can do to a broken man. I know what it's like to watch someone you care about fall into darkness, and I don't want that for him. I think you could be the one to save him, Tina. Tina stood slowly, feeling the weight of Idris' words sink into her. Could she really save Tgun? Did she even want to? And what about her own pain? She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him for what he had done. As the echoes of Idris' revelations fade into the night, Tina is left standing on the precipice of a choice that could alter the fate of them all. Tgun's walls may be cracking, but the path to redemption is fraught with peril and uncertainty. Will Tina's newfound understanding be the key to unlocking the man behind the menace, or will the shadows of the past consume them all? Join us in Part 3, where alliances will be forged, betrayals will surface, and the true battle for Tgun's soul begins. Don't miss the next chapter in this riveting saga, where every heartbeat counts and every decision shapes destiny. Thank you for listening. Till next time.